Time and Place by GingerBaggins. Chapter 12. A Time for Giving. Even before Hermione had wiped her parents' memories and shipped them off to Australia, she'd always favored Christmas at the Burrow. It was a whole event. The cooking, the cleaning, the de-gnoming of the garden, the ear-splittingly loud renditions of Celestina Warbeck songs. It was different without Fred, of course. The absence of him was inescapable, particularly when they were all together at the table. It was deeply unfair, as young Death always was, that he should not be here to share in or cause the delights. George had regained his humor over time, but it would never be what it once was. None of them would ever be what they once were, but they knew that Fred would have wanted the chaos to continue without him, and so they all worked a little bit harder to ensure that it did. A small tap came from the kitchen window, and a young owl sat perched on the sill holding a wax-sealed letter. Hermione peered up at it and tilted her head curiously. She'd seen this owl before. It had brought her a shrunken copy of Theo's thesis. "Hermione, dear, would you get it?" Molly called, her attention still focused on the culinary battlefield before her. She took the letter from the little creature and gave it a quick scratch under its chin. It offered a chirp of thanks before taking flight, clearly not expecting a response. She glanced down at the letter to find the recipient's name printed in what looked like a gold leaf. "It's for George," she said, and Molly glanced at her in confusion. "I'll go and find him." "He's out in the shed with Ron readying the brooms." Ah yes, the annual Weasley Quidditch match. The one Christmas tradition that she neither partook in nor enjoyed watching. It would go ahead regardless of weather, regardless of hunger, regardless of how desperately bored Hermione felt the entire time. Luckily for her, there was not a year that she did not receive a new book to keep her company while they played. George was indeed with Ron in the shed, the two of them arguing over who got to have Harry as their seeker. "He was on your team last year, you brat," George said, giving Ron a small shove. "He owes me," Ron replied, laughing. "I'll be sure to tell him the cost of your loyalty," she said, announcing her arrival with her hands on her hips, though she couldn't fully hide the joy on her face. This was so normal, Weasley's bickering over broomsticks. If there was one positive she'd learned from the war, it was a deep appreciation for normality. She held out a letter to George, waggling her eyebrows as she watched his face turn crimson. "Rather extensive penmanship for a Christmas card, isn't it?" she asked, and he leapt forward to rip the letter out of her hands before Ron could get to it first. "Who's writing to you?" Ron asked, reaching for it and looking at Hermione for backup. "Theodore Nott," she mouthed. "Who?" he mouthed back. She rolled her eyes, and George cleared his throat before tucking the letter into his front pocket. Hermione noticed it then. He was nervous, and Ronald's questioning, though perfectly innocent, was not going to help at all. "Molly wants your help stuffing the pheasants, Ron," she said. It was a lie, but she knew that if he walked even close to the kitchen, Molly would find some way to put him to work, especially since he could reach all the shelves that she couldn't. With a small whine, he dropped the broom and dragged his feet across the gardens, leaving Hermione alone with George, who looked rather unwell. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked, and he only nodded once before dropping on the floor. She settled beside him, letting her knees knock against his. "Are you going to open it?" "Yes," he said while shaking his head in contradiction. She snorted. "I thought you might have just been shagging him. But you actually like him, don't you?" George's ears were so red that she expected them to combust. He pulled the letter out of his pocket and glanced at her. She averted her eyes to give him some privacy as he read. George Weasley may not have completed his schooling, but he was no idiot. He ran a wildly successful business. He invented potions and toys and tricks. He was a marketing genius, and Hermione knew for a fact that he could read quite efficiently. Yet he must have been staring at that letter for over 15 minutes before her patience finally wore thin. "Is there an inch of it you have not yet memorized?" she sighed, peering at him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't reading the letter anymore. He was pressing it tightly against his chest. His eyes glazed and locked onto the sprawling gardens before them where Percy was still battling gnomes. "I wish he was here," he muttered. Hermione wasn't entirely sure who he meant. Theo, who had been fairly MIA since starting his new position at St. Mungo's, and whom she imagined was currently sitting across from Draco in a dining room too large for two, drinking fire whiskey and eating the finest meats. Or if he meant Fred, who would have found such unbridled joy in seeing his brother finally meet someone who turned him so giddy. In the end, she supposed it did not matter which of them he meant. Her answer would be the same for both. So do I. She didn't ask him what the letter said. She just helped him off the ground and let him boss her around as they readied the Quidditch gear. The game lasted until the late afternoon when Molly finally dragged them all inside to eat. And eat they did. It wasn't Christmas at the Burrow unless you felt physically unwell by the time dinner was out. Hermione drank too many eggnogs with Arthur, whom she'd gifted the box set of a new popular Muggle TV show about a plane crash. She hid behind an armchair when George, whom she'd gifted a selection of novelty socks, set off fireworks indoors. Gifts were passed without order. Hermione gave Harry a vinyl record and watched him try to explain how it worked to Ginny, who hadn't cared the first time and certainly didn't care now. For Ginny herself, a new pair of Quidditch gloves, the grateful yet amused look on her face told Hermione that she's chosen the wrong ones. For Ronald, a new leather wand harness. For Molly, a set of scented candles that she'd enchanted to never burn down. Bill and Fleur received gifts via Victory, who was chewing her way through a bag of dentist-approved sweets. Percy had accepted his leather-bound notebook with the same stiffness he carried everywhere, and she tried very hard not to hold it against him. Charlie was always the hardest to shop for, a man of few and simple pleasures, but he'd ruffled her hair in thanks when she presented him with some Muggle craft beer. Hermione received books, as she did every year, almost always non-fiction and heavy enough to do some damage if dropped. Ginny, however, had spent the last few years slowly infiltrating Hermione's coveted shelf space with Muggle erotica, which Hermione found utterly absurd and embarrassing and very difficult to put down once opened. She tried hard not to think of her parents, to wonder what they were doing and who they were doing it with, to wonder if they ever noticed the space in their lives where she had once been, if they sat around the table and stared at the extra chair, questioning who should be sat there. She'd done the right thing by sending them away. Harry and Ron had paid a visit to her childhood home and found it ransacked, and it wasn't like her life was miserable without them. Molly and Arthur had always ensured that she had a place to call home, and her friends were about as close to family as people could be without sharing DNA. But she would be lying if she said she didn't feel the ache of their absence. Christmas passed without incident, something nobody ever took for granted, and she spent enough of the remaining break relaxing with Crookshanks and only a small portion of it stressing about how dramatically she felt her work had stalled. She fell asleep with the TV on one night and woke up to find the teleshopping channel playing loudly. As she went to turn it off, the presenter picked up the next item, and she hesitated. It was a silly idea, but she was pretty sure she knew what to get Malfoy for Christmas. Her return to the office was somewhat of a relief. The war she'd already won still waited for her. The Time Turner was still a cursed and mysterious object that seemed to revel in mocking her inability to best it. And the cauldron in the room beside hers was still yet to produce a potion that would give her the time she needed to figure out the rest of it. The break had been needed, but served as a painful reminder of how important her task was. There would be no more Christmases at the Burrow if she failed. She kicked open the door to her office, her hands preoccupied with carrying a badly wrapped box, only to find Malfoy already waiting at her desk with a box of his own. "You're early," she commented. He looked good, really good, too good. His glasses were on, his hair was loose instead of pushed back by various charms. Had he gotten better looking over the last week? It had only been a week, right? Nice to see you too, Granger, he mused, mouth turning up into a warm smile. Though I am slightly humiliated that your box is bigger than mine. She snorted and closed the space between them, placing the box on her desk and sliding it over to him. Well, at least I now know how little you value my friendship. I think you'll find that this, he said, picking up the smaller box and holding it out to her, is the most valuable thing I own. You go first, she said, knowing that spoiled child in him could not possibly refuse. He made somewhat of a song and dance about it, a lot of huffing and eye-rolling, but she noticed how his greedy hands ripped at the paper like a wild animal. She watched in delight as his face cycled through every motion humanly possible at the sight of his gift, eventually landing on confusion. Granger, what am I looking at? It's a shuttle, she explained, pointing to the image on the box. Muggles use them to explore space, but this one is made of plastic blocks called Lego. You build it, it's like a puzzle. He stared at it in bewilderment, and for a moment she wondered if she'd made an almighty mistake by buying this traditional pureblood wizard an expensive Muggle toy. But then he looked up at her with shining blue eyes that seemed to tune everything else into a dull blur. I can't use magic? He asked. I suppose you could, but that would defeat the point. Don't worry, it comes with instructions. He nodded as though this were a very serious undertaking. Muggles go to space in these? Not those exact ones, of course, but much bigger ones that are made of stronger materials. I'd like to know more about these shuttles. She laughed at the thought of Draco Malfoy going through a very Muggle child-esque space obsession at the tender age of 25. I've got a few books you can borrow. His attention fell onto the unopened box in front of her, and he suddenly looked nervous. Your turn, he said, clearing his throat. Hermione made quick work of wrapping, commenting briefly on his remarkable ribbon-tying skills before she lifted the lid and pulled out a rather unremarkable-looking mug. She turned it over in her hands, letting out a loud and unrestrained cough when she saw what it says. SPEW. Oh, wow, she chuckled. I had about 5 of these produced in 4th year. Can you believe I only sold 2? Where did you get this one made? He shook his head, a grin splitting wide. Not made, Granger. Bought second-hand, with real gold. You're holding original SPEW merchandise. Her gaze snapped to his, her eyes going wide. You are joking. I'm not. I paid a first year for it, intending to deface it and resell it, though in the end just end up collecting dust, he explained, his sharp features softening. It came to hold some sentimentality over the years, so I kept it. He had kept it. He had packed it into his trunk and taken it home to the manor. He'd kept it throughout Voldemort's stay there and gotten it through an entire war without so much as a crack. He'd chosen it as something worth coming with him when he moved out of the manor and into whatever he called home now. This mug was a decade old, and it looked as new as the day she'd first seen it. That's not all, he continued, eyes burning with glee. Theo got roped into working at Christmas, so I spent most of the week here. Her face fell. Oh, you could have... He held up a hand to stop her. It's fine. In fact, it's better than fine. I think I've brewed more in the last week than I did throughout my entire mastery. And? She asked breathlessly. Her skin was beginning to tingle at the anticipation of where she knew this was going. He beamed. And I think it's time we source test an object. Holy shit! Holy shit! Holy shit! She quickly placed the mug down on the desk and threw herself at him, her arms locking around his neck as she gripped him like he was a lifeline. He caught her quickly, long arms wrapping around her waist, a startled laugh bursting from his mouth. She could feel his heartbeat matching hers, Rapid and out of control, she buried her face into his shoulders and breathed in the strong smell of him, wishing to stay right there for the remainder of the afternoon. But they were co-workers and recent friends. Neither of those things suggested she should be latching onto him and breathing him in, so she reluctantly leaned back. Malfoy, however, did not release his grip on her waist, meaning that she only ended up coming face to face with him at a startling close distance. From here, she could see every mixed shade of blue and gray in his eyes. "This is the best gift," she said, inching closer. "Everybody always gets me books." "That would have been easier," he replied, smirking. She shouldn't ask the question that sat on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't help it. Hermione had never been able to push a question down, certainly not when it pertained to him. "Do you miss Christmases at the manor?" His arms stiffened around her, but he did not drop them. "Not really," he said, left eye twitching. "I do miss my mother, though. She writes to me sometimes." "Do you write back?" she asked. "I'm not ready to," he said, and she wondered how many sessions with a mind healer it had taken to admit that. "Why do you spend holidays with the Weasleys?" She frowned. "They are family to me." "I know," he replied, arms squeezing her a touch tighter. "But why don't you spend them with your parents?" She'd not expect that. No one ever brought her parents up without such torturous and careful build-up. Everyone knew what she'd done, how she'd crudely carved herself out of their lives and set them to the other side of the world. Everyone knew except Malfoy. His eyes widened as he took in her obvious shock, and he parted his lips to produce what she knew would be another apology, so she spoke before he could begin. "I obliviated them during the war before we went hunting for Horcruxes," she said, and his mouth slammed closed. "I knew the position it would put them in if I'd let them there. The parents of undesirable number 2, they'd have been tortured. So I erased it all and sent them to Australia with new names." "Hermione." "Wendell and Monica Wilkins are doing just fine. They run a moderately successful private dental clinic, and they host bi-monthly neighborhood community meetings in their spacious kitchen. Monica took up pottery 3 years ago and started selling her vases at local markets on the weekends. Wendell is writing a book on the various uses of fertilizer. They eat at the same Italian restaurants every second Thursday of the month, and they have absolutely no idea about magic, about the war, or about me." Granger. "I knew when I cast the spell that it would be permanent, that level of alteration would be potentially catastrophic to undo, especially to someone with no magic. I have a healer assigned to their case over there. She updates me frequently, but it's hard to treat them without them knowing about it, as you can imagine. I visit twice a year, though indirectly. I usually listen to them bicker about which peanut butter to buy from the next aisle over. They aren't really allowed to see me. It could cause them discomfort, so She was pulled into a bone-crushing hug, and she found herself melting into it instantly, only just becoming aware of the tears that had escaped and rolled down her cheeks. Draco was breathing hard, and so was she. She concentrated on matching his rhythm. His hands were fisted into the fabric of her shirt, his cheek resting on the crown of her head. It was exactly what she hadn't known she needed. She wanted to ask him to squeeze harder till her joints popped. "That's where you went the other month, before we fought in the pub?" he asked quietly, and she nodded. "It was my birthday. I usually go then." "I didn't know. Potter and Weasley never, though I suppose they wouldn't," he whispered. "And I missed your sodding birthday." "It's okay," she smiled into his chest, feeling so much lighter than she had all Christmas. "There's always the next year." "Next year," he hummed, hands unclenching and rubbing small circles into her back. She angled her head to look up at him and found he was already staring at her. His lips parted slightly, his breath dancing across her cheeks, and oh no, 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 no. She stilled quickly, stepping out of his embrace. A brief flicker of hurt danced in his eyes, but he made no move to hold her there. "Are you alright?" he asked, brows pulling together in concern. "I'm sorry if that conversation was too much. I'm quite well," she lied. "Thank you, Draco, for the mug and, well, for all of it. It means a lot." "You are welcome," he said, slowly straightening his shirt from where she had rumpled it. "Thank you for my plastic space." "Shadow," she finished, forcing out a smile. "Right," he said, standing up from where he'd been perched on the corner of her desk. "Should I gather my notes in a small vial?" "Please." She was nodding too much. Her voice was an octave too high. She watched as his eyes narrowed at her, as though he had 1,000 more things to say before he turned and disappeared into his office, leaving the door open behind him. Hermione spun back to her desk, eyes locked onto the mug that shouldn't still exist. He shouldn't have kept it. He shouldn't have cared for it. He shouldn't have given it to her without realizing quite how lovely of a gift it was. He shouldn't have left her ramble and cry onto his chest. He shouldn't have listened to her talk about her parents. He shouldn't have held her through it like she was precious, and he certainly shouldn't smell like that. She caught spearmint on his breath, and now all she wanted to do was taste it. Author notes: there's something awful about writing Christmas chapters in October. Well, I kind of enjoy reading them. And that's the end of chapter 12.